Communities, we all take them for granted. We live, work, and raise our families in them, never stopping to think about the rich history of where we live. Hello and welcome to CETconnect.org. I'm Michael Baker. My three guests today have done more than just think about their community. They have embraced the historic history of Goshen and created a wonderful look back. With me today is Jim Cook, representing the Goshen Historical Society, Stacy Stith, graphic designer and owner of Stith Graphics, and Graham Davis, a former resident of Goshen. Good afternoon. Glad that you all three could come down with us this afternoon. Jim, let me start with you. What gave you the idea for a photographic look back at Goshen?
Well, I've always had an interest in the community in which I grew up, and when I was away at college I started noticing a lot of changes, and I took a number of photographs. Later I ran into a book that was called America Then and Now, and what I noticed about the book was that they reenacted the original scenes. They would show, say, a picture of railroad workers standing by a locomotive, and then they recreated that scene with the same pose and the same, except obviously newer people, newer locomotive. And I thought, I wonder if I could apply that to Goshen's history, show you how it looks now so you recognize it and say, oh, there it is, and then show you how it used to look. That was where the idea for how to set up the book came from.
And I know I understand, too, that you've been taking pictures of Goshen throughout your life thinking, you know, one day these pictures might actually come in handy for something.
Like I say, I went off to college at Miami University, and when I'd come home on weekends, I'd notice things are changing, and so I went out on several occasions and stood alongside the highway and took photos. I felt kind of foolish, and I figured the cars are going by wondering, what's this guy about? But I said to myself, well, one of these days there's going to be a historical society, and they're going to want these photos of everyday sort of things. Well, the surprise was that the society arrived only about 10 years later, and then I joined them as soon as I could. And the photos already showed things that were missing within a short space of time, so I'm glad I took them. So
that you basically, I mean, you became a historian yourself.
Yeah,
without realizing
self-appointed. Self-appointed, not official, but I took an interest, and really all it takes is to do a lot of documentation, write down what you hear, photograph what you see, and save it for the next guy.
And Graham, I'd like to ask you a question too. I know that when Jim came up with this idea, it kind of fell by the wayside for a little while, but you were very instrumental in kind of giving it a resurgence to the book. You didn't want this to die. What were your feelings about that?
Well, I think the townships surrounding Goshen and Stone Lick and others have such a rich and colorful history to them that it's a perfect subject, and I just didn't want it to die. And I really felt that Jim had something here that would be of lasting value for future generations. And I see this not just for Goshen, but for, as I just said, other the surrounding townships, and that's where Stacy's tremendous design experience came in, to be able to put and bring the story alive, take Jim's photographs, and she's done a marvelous job with it. That's just what I see.
And I understand you brought Stacy to the project, if I'm not mistaken.
I did, yeah.
And Stacy, I know that you've, I mean, I've seen some of your design work around town, incredible artistic work that you do. Stith Graphics is synonymous in Cincinnati. Kind of share some feelings about, you know, when Jim came to you with all these photographs. I mean, it must have been very overwhelming. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with all these photographs?
Oh, yes.
And, you know, I've seen a copy of the book, at least the front cover, and it looks like a family album, you know, which in itself is just, it's a wonderful thing to look at. Can you kind of share a few of your thoughts of, you know, how working with the files and the photographs, I mean, what that brought back to you?
Well, as you said, the content was massive. I mean, 56 pages of photography can be a bit overwhelming, but, you know, as I paged through the pictures and kind of became familiar with the content, I found that it was like looking at, you know, your grandmother's photos in the attic. And it was about reminiscing, and although I'm not really familiar with the places that they were showing, I kind of felt how they grew through the pictures of the photography, which kind of made it like a kind of reminded me of a photo album, looking at a family photo album, and that's where the design went.
And is this the only historical book that you've worked on?
I've actually worked with several historical societies. This is quite unique. It's not a marketing brochure that I'm used to, or some other piece of marketing material. This is an artistic piece. And that's what kind of made it, set it aside, set it different, to make it unique. I mean, it's going to be a coffee table book, definitely.
Sounds incredible.
Yeah.
And Jim, I know that you've probably got 1,000 humorous stories that you could share with us about gathering these photographs together. And I know we'd love to hear a few. I know I've heard some story that you're actually 100 years old. You don't look 100 years old, Jim, but I've heard that story.
Well, I'll prelude that by saying that, sometimes you see someone out of context, like you see somebody from your church in the grocery store, and you think, I know that person, but I can't think where I knew him from. Well, imagine that going on in the mind of a kindergartner, and then here's what happened. I had a photograph of my second grade classroom, and that classroom is still there. I knew which one it was, I remembered. I made arrangements with the school to go and photograph the classroom again, this time with the kids who are in there now. So got permission, made the arrangements. I showed up at school, and I walk into the classroom, and there's my nephew. He's in my old classroom.
Oh my gosh.
So I showed the kids some old photos of like a horse-drawn school hack, which was what they had before buses, and showed them a picture of the old school when it was brand new in 1908. And I talked about how these photos were about 100 years old, and that I was taking a new photo and that it would hopefully end up in a book. And so the kids lined up, and I got my photo, and I told the teacher about, that's my nephew, and I said hello to him. So I go my way, and I find out later that my nephew goes home and tells his mom, yeah, this guy came to my school today. He said that he was my uncle and that he had gone to school there 100 years ago. So I loved it. But there were some other, while I was doing the so-called present scenes, which were actually near the end of 2003, I ran into a few things that seemed like more than coincidence. For example, I had in my hands a photograph of a horse-drawn mail-carrying wagon, and it was taken in old downtown Goshen. I was looking for that site, and what should come along but a lady in a mail jeep delivering mail. Her name was Tammy, and I showed her the picture, told her what it was about, asked her if she would pose for a similar picture in her mail jeep, and she consented. Well, then, as I'm talking to her, I realized that the house behind her bears an uncanny resemblance to the one in the photo. So I was able to turn her around, take a photo that's really an exact replica of the original. Then I went to the old school. I wanted to get upstairs and take a photo from the upper floor, showing the scene across the street to match an old photo I had. And the building was empty, although they still had some people in there. They were understandably reluctant to let me go up. They were like, we don't know you and might be unsafe, and we need to get permission. When in steps one of my former teachers, he says, hey, Jim, what are you doing? I said, well, hello, Mr. Schmidbauer. Told him what I was about, what we were doing. And the whole mood changed suddenly, and I was escorted to the top floor to get my photo. But maybe the best was, and forgive me if I go on too long,
please.
It was fun.
It's very interesting.
Putting this together was actually fun. From there, I decided I need a picture of a new school bus, because I already had a photo of the original ones, the original motorized ones from 1931, plus a horse-drawn one. And so I went to the bus garage in hopes that there was one sitting outside and I could take a photo. Well, I got better than that. I showed up when they're having their Thanksgiving banquet. The place is loaded with bus drivers, including a fellow named John Paul Jones, whose son went to school with me, as it turns out. John Paul Jones, it seems, had driven buses for 33 years. He had ridden on the horse-drawn ones when he was a kid. He had driven the first motorized ones, well, maybe a little after that. And he verified everything I'd heard. He added some detail, and I got a photograph of a bus to include him. He was in the group that posed in front of the bus. So, you know, what are the chances? I just happened to stumble into their banquet.
Sounds like more like a trip down memory lane. I mean, and I'm sure you discovered a lot of local heroes and folklore and stuff like that. I mean, it sounds like an incredible journey just putting the book together. Stacy, I want to ask you too. I know that there may be other townships out there right now that are watching this right now that might be interested in challenging their township, to create a book like this. There's Cincinnati and surrounding areas. I mean, there's a host of very, very rich history here in Ohio. Perhaps they'd like to use your services. Do you have a website?
Yes, I do. It's stithgraphics.com. That's STITH graphics.com.
That's perfect. And Jim, I know that you work with the Historical Society of Goshen. I'm sure they got a website.
They do.
And that website is?
That would be goshenhistory.org. Goshenhistory.org.
Well, I'd like to thank all three of you for being here this afternoon, and I'm hoping that maybe other townships have saw this and maybe they've gotten excited about starting a project like that for themselves.
Well, thank you for having us here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
This has been Michael Baker with CETconnect.org.